Okay, let me share screen. Hello, everyone. Glad you're here. And I'll bring this up. And here we begin. This presentation will make a little bit more sense if I give you a little bit of my background. I have 3 college degrees, and one of them is in liberal arts with journalism. Another is theology from a conservative school. And then this is my final degree, Master's of Architecture from the University of Texas at Austin. If Kathleen were here, she'd recognize this picture. She lives in Austin. But it's important that I mention these because, well, let's go to degree number 2. It was at a conservative college. I was also raised Catholic. And what that has to do with my development is that having left the Catholic Church for a conservative religion, and then having left that for the Aquarian age, I have learned the vicissitudes of changing one's mind. And with what I'm going to talk about, and all these notions I have, and beliefs and propositions, it's always the best I can do today, February 19th, 2023. Tomorrow, it might change. Don't hold me to it. And that's just the way it's been for the last 40 years. So I have certainly no corner on the truth. Though, as a human being, it seems that we keep asking about that. We keep wondering about that question, and so do I. So anyway, at the University of Texas, at one of the courses I took, I was introduced to a book called The Tao of Physics by Fritjof Capra. And that was my introduction to well, back then it was more the Aquarian age. It's become the New Age. And it was a good introduction for me because I was very intellectual. And today you might say, well, you still are, but I had to learn to get away from that. I found, especially as I got into my psychic work. The Tao of Physics was a great introduction for me because it was, on one hand, intellectual, on the other hand, went into the concepts that, at least from the scientific point of view, pointed to more than just a material world. Okay, so after getting out of Texas, let's see, I practiced architecture, did mostly residential work, low and middle income. This is a project I did in Massachusetts, 66-unit condo project. And so I spent a good time of my working life doing that, mostly in my own businesses, which I preferred doing instead of working for someone. But the other part of my working career was teaching, which I enjoyed very much. And one of the courses that I enjoyed very much was teaching architecture. And this is the type of slide I would present. I will show this slide later because it's going to bear on what I have to say. But in architecture, what I did was I showed how what was produced in architecture, the expressions of architecture, the different eras were all based in culture, and that's how I put together my course, and that'll come in later as well. Now, let's jump to about 2002. And I was looking for a group, a spiritual group to join, and I found one with a woman in Cambridge, Massachusetts, Bonnie Faith. And I started attending her groups and learning quite a bit. She was psychic, and it was through her that I started to learn how to read as an intuitive. Now, this is my first image that I ever got. Just take out the 2 figures, and I'll have my little pointer here. These were not in it. But this Christ figure was a lot bloodier. And Bonnie was reading a woman, and I got this image of her or for her, and I had never had anything like this happen. And I was wondering, what do I do? Do I tell her, oh, by the way, for you, I just saw the crucified Christ? And I felt, I just didn't say anything because I was, this was just so surprising that this would show up. And afterwards, at this meeting, we had a host and hostess who served soup. And the woman that had been read for by Bonnie, and whom I'd seen this image, was sitting at the table eating soup and started to complain about her life. This was going wrong, that was going wrong. And I realized that's what the image meant. She's crucifying herself. And so I learned a lot that day. And I found that, as I've gone along in my, my career, well, not a career, but my experiences as an intuitive, that there's this expression, if you see it, say it. Well, this is what I saw, but I think there are some things you just don't say. You have to learn how to present it, and that's one of the things I learned. I started to learn that day that there is a way to present information. I also learned that imagery is the way that spirit works with me. So, in terms of being an intuitive, my strongest point is clairvoyance. Even though I've had clairaudient experiences, it's really clairvoyance. And imagination, as they say, is the door. So one of the things I've done in my intuitive work is to create a sailboat. And it looks much like this. And the only difference is that there's a light at the top of the mast. So when I'm reading someone, say in circle, I will put them in a sailboat. And then I'll look at the sailboat and I'll notice, all right, are the sails trim? Or maybe they're not there. What's the, is it night? Is it day? Is it windy? Is it calm? And the light at the top of the mast, is it lit? Is it dim? And I find that using this, I can get information about a person I'm reading. Now, it's very interesting that there is far more information in pictures than there are in words, and I've learned that. Imagine trying to describe this sailboat in words, having never seen it. How many pages and pages it would take to do this? But here it is, you can see it right in front of you. And so, if I've seen people with the sails are in the boat and it looks like a mess, and I find out, well, their life is a mess. I've seen people that have been tossed about, and I realize they're having some difficulties in their life. I've seen the light at the top of the mast flickering, and so they're not working with their guidance, which is what it means for me. And sometimes, just like this fellow, I just see them sailing along, and things are just going well in their life. And I find this sailboat can give me a lot of information. So that's one of the ways I read people. I create this image, put them in the boat, and see how they do. Now, one of the other things that I have learned as I've gone along is, how do I know what I'm saying is correct? And that's a question that all psychics have. And one way is through affirmation, where you're sitting in a circle of people and you say one thing to someone and someone else says, well, I see the same thing. That's, we psychics like to hear that because it affirms we're getting. But another way I do it is through what I call the knowing. And it's working with guides. I have 4 that I work with, and it's just going to a calm and peaceful place and asking, is what I'm saying correct? And I have to have a certain feeling about the correctness, and then I know. It's not easy to describe, but but that's how I do it. And I find that's very helpful. Now, the other thing about doing this kind of work and sitting in circles, and I also read people when I do Reiki every week, and I also read them, is that I see this as a service. This is my service. I don't think of ever doing this for entertainment. I wouldn't if I was asked. I believe this is a service. This is an ability that I have, and I will use it to help people. And so that's what I try to do with it as much as I can. Now, I'm just giving you an overview of what I do. So I'm going to move on to another area. Remember, what I've learned from my experiences as a psychic is that imagination is the door. Now, this has been very helpful in my work with nature. Back in 2007, I was living in a condo development that had a pond. And I would go to the pond and I started to communicate with a water spirit. And imagine this figure that I'm showing you without the rays and without that, whatever she's holding. That's sort of what she looked like, except she was blue. And I learned as I went along, as I saw other water spirits like this, they have different colors. So this one happened to be blue. And she gave me her name. At first, she gave me her Davic name, or her fairy name, which was very long and unpronounceable. And then it came out that I could call her Ariana. And so I did. And I discovered that she liked working with my heart chakra. And she told me quite a bit of information, especially how she is connected to everything. And she's connected to since the pond is on the water, she's connected to the entire earth. Since the pond is connected to the atmosphere, she's connected to that. And then out into outer space with the solar wind and the particles in space and the light that comes from the other stars and galaxies. And so it was just very interesting that she had that kind of range. Now, I worked with another water spirit, and this is the pond that I met her at. I was living in a town called Goshen in Massachusetts, and there was a pond just down the road. And I would go here, and I discovered, there's another water spirit. Now, the thing about these spirits is they have personalities. Ariana was very forthcoming, very personable. But this one, whose name I received, Alnaria, she was more reticent. Now, she was white. Her color was white, like this water spirit here, as it's depicted in this art piece. But finally, she, warmed up, and she worked with the third eye chakra. So she was very helpful with things I was doing at the time, working in different centers, running classes, and doing intuitive work. And one of the things that she told me, and it was very interesting because the water spirits will give you information once you start working with them. If you look at this line of trees here, one day she told me how to see their aura as in the reflection of the water. And so I looked, and sure enough, there it was. And I found, and you think, well, are you making that up? Maybe if you stare at it long enough, you'll see it. But I tried doing it on my own on other days, and it just didn't happen. So, you think, well, maybe there is something to this. Anyway, from working with the Fae, or the Davis as they're called, I decided, well, it's nice to wear, if you can see this. This is a fairy star, and it's 7-pointed. And I got that back in 2007 or 8. And I've been wearing it ever since because I just feel that I like this connection with the Fae, with the spirits of the natural world. Now, that's some of my experiences with water spirits. I've also seen stream spirits. I could go on, but I want to go on to stones. Now, there's a lot, of course, in the New Age about crystals and, buying crystals, owning crystals, working with crystals, etc. But I found that I could work with stones, and usually they're large, and there's stones that look like this. And the way I started was I was staying at a spiritual retreat. I was walking along a path on my way to a cabin to do some work, and I walked over this stone that was sort of embedded in the path, and it said hello. I could hear it now. It didn't say it out loud. It said it in my mind. And I thought, I've got things to do. And then I thought, well, it isn't every day a stone talk to you. So I decided to stop and commune with the stone. And I found that this stone seemed to have a face, and it started to tell me information. Now, I learned that stones can communicate. The Native Americans know this, and it's just that we think, well, that's just a rock. How could it do that? But they do. For instance, I was sitting on a stone in Panama, a large stone like this one, and it had come out of a volcano, and I said to it, "You are very old." And the stone replied in my mind, "You are older." Now, did I make that up? I don't know, but I've had so many experiences with the stones in this sort of situation that I just feel, yeah, there's something to it. So I also learned stones have faces. And this was a stone that was next to the one that first said hello. It was in the ground, and it led me to dig it up and put it on this stone here. I also put this stone in front of it. I found as I went along in my education that stones wish to be honored. They enjoy being honored. Now, this stone has a face. If you look very carefully, there's one eye, there's another eye, and there's the nose. Now, this is kind of latent. You think, oh, of course, that stone would have a face. But then I learned that, well, if you know where to look, they have faces, like this stone here. If you look at it, you think, oh, it's just a stone, large boulder, but there's an eye, and there's the nose. So all stones have faces. You just have to look for them. And after I learned about that, I saw faces in stones everywhere. Now, here's another stone I worked with. This was at that spiritual retreat center. This one was very comforting. I was there in 2017 to help myself get over my daughter's death. I sat on this stone, and it comforted me. Said, "You have been through this many times," and stones will help you like that when you start working with them, in my experience. Also, there's a lot of talk about grounding in the world of the New Age. In fact, for we psychics and even the mediums, grounding is very important, grounding and protection. And I have found that one of the strongest methods of grounding is sitting on a stone. Now, this is my experience, and I figure stones are masters at grounding, because where else are they found but on the ground? And they have, of course, a relationship connection with the earth. And I sat on a stone. In fact, it's just down the street from where I live, and grounded. And I thought, wow, this is a really profound grounding experience. And well, big surprise. You know, this is what stones can do. Now, this you might find unusual, but here's another stone at that retreat site. It's called Starseed. It's in Savoy, Massachusetts. This stone's about 4 feet high. And in working with it, I found it's feminine. So it taught me that stones have gender. And when you commune with the stones, you can find, well, some are masculine, some are feminine. And I call this a grandmother stone. You know, the Native Americans call these grandfathers. But this, to me, was a grandmother stone. And I have many times draped myself over that stone and just felt the love coming from it, the love of like a grandmother. And again, imagination is the door for me, and that's what I feel. And that's what some of the things that stones have taught me, and I've, could tell you a lot more, but those are some of the things I've learned. Now, I want to move along because I have quite a bit to cover. If stones have faces, maybe trees do as well. And I've worked with tree spirits. If you look very carefully, there are the eyes, there's the mouth, and there's the nose. Fortunately, this tree spirit is right in my backyard. I say hello to her every morning when I walk the dog. And in working with tree spirits, they also have personalities. This tree spirit, you have to, I found you have to ask permission. I wanted to take a photo so I could show it to this group. And she said, fine. I have taken photos of other tree spirits that I've seen in trees. And I look at it and they're sort of fuzzy and the image is not clear and I can't actually see the tree spirit face in it. So some of them are more cooperative than others. I worked with a tree spirit that I really had to honor. In fact, I had to be very careful about walking around her space. But she warmed up to me because I created a little stone monument across the path from her. They talk about forest bathing. I've walked through forests and I stop and I realize the trees know I'm there. Trees have consciousness as far as I'm concerned. And it's as if without eyes, they're looking at you. And I've had this experience several times. And I just know that they're conscious. I've come to where, a tree is being cut down and I feel sorrow because to me, they have, they're alive, far, far more than we think they are. Trees will create groves when you know to look. For instance, this arrangement of trees is actually down the street, and they created this configuration. I've never been inside there because part of the problem is this is on a suburban street, and I don't want to stand there and difficult to work. But if I were in a forest, I would talk to the tree spirits and ask them, is it all right to walk into the middle of that? I wouldn't just do it. Trees like to be honored. Getting permission to me is important. And this tree, these trees actually told me this place is special because at one point they grew this little mushroom and said, hey, take a look here. And that's what they tend to do. Now I'm going to close this portion out. I haven't worked with these beings. These are the thunder beings. If you look here, and you'll never look at a cloudy sky the same way again if you follow. You see the eye there? This is a thunder being, and they're the ones that work with the weather. And I learned about them from an Indian shaman named Sun Bear. He has unfortunately passed many years ago, but he was very prominent in the 80s, especially because he felt that the white people needed to know the Indian wisdom. And a lot of Native Americans said, no, you can't tell them that. But he said, no, it's time. And he wrote books about it. I actually heard him speak. He was a wonderful speaker. But he talked about the thunder beings. And I have this slide because it's very difficult to have a slide of wind. But I also learned to talk with the wind. And the way I did it was it's sort of like dowsing. Now, you're all familiar with pendulum dowsing. You hold a pendulum and you say, show me yes, and it spins maybe clockwise. Show me no, spins maybe counterclockwise. Well, I found you can do the similar thing with the wind. Now, it helps if you're in a very quiet forest. And fortunately, where I lived in Massachusetts before moving to Albany, I had that quiet where, so quiet you could hear it. And I sat on a stone, which is good to do, helps with the grounding. And I heard the wind. It was coming through the trees. And I said, tell me yes. And the wind blew I don't remember exactly how it blew, but it was a short gust. And then I asked, tell me no. And it was a longer gust. And I would ask questions. And they were yes, no questions. And I would get either a shorter gust or a longer gust. And I felt, wow, I can talk to the wind. And I learned from all these experiences that the knowledge in nature is still available. We think, what did the ancients know from nature? What did the plants, I haven't gotten into the plant devas, but what did they tell people? What did the stones tell them? What did the animals tell them? I haven't gotten into animals either. But it's all still there today. And I feel nothing is lost if we wanted it all back. We just have to talk to this natural world. And what's interesting is that the Native Americans say today that given the way the world is, a return to nature is crucial. And what they're talking about is not just a walk in the woods or taking care of the environment and pollution. I feel it's also actually communicating with these Davic spirits. Okay, so nature and imagination. Imagination that I learned how to use imagination as a psychic in the world of nature. Now I'm going to bring it to bear on the rest of the presentation, which will be about reincarnation and just one view of it. And I noticed last week with Cheryl, there was quite a bit of interest in this subject. And this has to do with a hypothesis I've come up with. This is not something I feel is solid. I'm glad I'm presenting it to this group. You're very savvy. And if you chewed it all apart today, fine with me. But it is something I've noticed because, when I was teaching architecture, one of the things I did was, I call it spinning a synthesis. It's just seeing how things went together in terms of architecture history and how building forms were created. And I've seen things with reincarnation and the culture in which we find ourselves and cultures that have passed that are very interesting. And to start off, all art is derived from the culture in which it finds itself. This is the way I structured my architecture course, and starting with ancient Egypt all the way to the present. You can't step out of the time in which you're in. We have people that do, say, Victorian recreations, and you think, oh, it's just like it was back then. No, it isn't. It's our idea of what it was like back then. And we are always, you could say, prisoners of our culture. And so I noticed things about reincarnation. So I'm going to start with the most common model, which I call linear reincarnation. This is the sequence of lives. And this is, of course, gained more acceptance as we've come into the New Age, especially since Edgar Cayce. But if we look at the age in which it was first or came into prominence, it was the Industrial Revolution era. The time of, if you follow along here, left brain emphasis, thinking in terms of linear, sequential ways. It was very time-oriented. Newtonian science was the ruling science of the time. Industrial Revolution era, by the way, is, you could date it maybe 1740 to say 1980. You had the theory of evolution, Charles Darwin, 1856. Emphasis on progress and growth, very goal-oriented in the way it thought. Public education was started during this period, both in Europe and America in the 1800s. There's certainly a society of rules and an emphasis on individuality, and we saw this especially in America. So we look at linear reincarnation, which, one life after another, and I find, well, there are similarities. For instance, linear reincarnation is an understandable system where our lives are sequential, happening within Earth time. And here we have a left brain emphasis in the Industrial Revolution. Things are linear, very time-oriented. This is an easy system to understand. You have one life after another, sort of like Newtonian science, very easy to understand, very straightforward. And in the Industrial Revolution, we have the theory of evolution. The way reincarnation is discussed, our souls are evolving. There's progress to be made. It's emphasized. We have the rise of public education in the Industrial Revolution era. We have Earth in reincarnation as a school where lessons are learned, just like the classroom. We have a society of rules. In our Industrial Revolution era, here we're subject to the rule of karma. This is a culture of goals. We have the goal to stop returning. And we have this emphasis on individuality. And in this linear reincarnation system, it is seemingly all up to you. The geometry that I feel works with this system is the line. The intent is achievement. And so here we have the line. And as you all know from your studies of reincarnation, you can put your lives somewhere along the line. And I've done past life regression, and certainly I can do that myself. In fact, I had a nice reincarnation right there in the first Assyrian dynasty. I actually got a date, checked it, and it was right. This affirmation. Okay, so that's how I look at it for linear reincarnation, using this hypothesis. Now let's take it further. Here we are in the information era, the computer age. And that started, around 1980. I mean, in the early 80s, late 70s, there were already computers, but it really starts there. What really helped it to take off was the personal computer, which of course we're all using now. And this was also the era where the right brain was finally recognized. For those of you who've been involved in art, you might have come across Betty Edwards' book, Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain. And the right side, of course, is the intuitive side, the non-linear side. This is the time where quantum mechanics now lead science. We also have the computer, which is capable of simultaneous functions. We have great connection through social media. We're doing that today with Zoom. Certainly knowledge expansion through the internet. It isn't like the old encyclopedia where you thumb through and that's all you got. You can just find all sorts of information through the internet. We know all this. We also have the video game, and they're rather sophisticated these days too. I have a couple of young men living with me. They play these computer games, the graphics, having been in the visual world of architecture and having used computer graphics. it's just sensational what they do today with color, shadows, textures, very, very lifelike. And how does this all uh, relate to reincarnation? Well, we have another form of reincarnation, which is simultaneous. Now, the first time I read about it was through Jane Roberts, but this was back, she wrote her books in the 70s, Seth Material, Seth Speaks. And I read them in the 80s and said, I think there's something to this, that all your incarnations happen at the same time. But over the years, I didn't see much on it. Finally, Neil Donald Walsh comes along with his Conversations with God series, and it starts to come more on the radar. And what it is, let me go to this little illustration here, is here is your higher self. And here are emanations from the higher self. And there's one life. Here's another. Here's another emanation. It's as if the soul is split, or I should say, has expressions of itself in these different lives. And let's say this one is me, 2023. Here I am in 1932 in another life. Here I am in 1871 in another life. And so what we see in this model is, instead of lives being linear, one right after the other, they're happening all at once, and it just looks to us as if they're happening in sequence. So that's kind of how it works. But this system, because it lacks time, as we know, it is more difficult to comprehend. All the lives are lived at once, as there is no time. And that's what drew me to this in terms of a system, is because on the other side, as near-death experience has shown, there's no time. And so how do you get your head around there's no time, and yet here our lives seem to be sequential? Well, in this model, the wheel helps to point out how that might happen. Now, you have the simultaneous planning of lives then, because all the lives happen at once. Gary, you asked last week about how can a child with marks on it reflect another life where maybe they were shot? How can that happen if all the lives are simultaneous? Well, my feeling is the way they happen is that there's a simultaneous planning of lives, and it's all figured out. And certainly the computer, which is capable of simultaneous functions, helps us to understand how that can happen. Also, we have multiple locations of soul possible. In the linear model, you're there one life at a time. In this model, you're in multiple locations at one time. And that's where quantum mechanics comes in, because quantum mechanics is more nebulous. For instance, is a particle, or is an atom a wave, or is it a particle? And also one, they call it entanglement. One particle affects the other no matter how far apart. So we find that because we're not in the Newtonian era so much anymore, even though we use a lot of Newtonian science, we can understand that, maybe it's more like quantum mechanics, where multiple locations are possible. And just like connection through social media, we're connected to all our lives at once, and we're connected to the one. And we have knowledge expansion through the internet. And so in this model, rather than coming to Earth to learn lessons, we're coming to expand ourselves. And the video game tells us that Just like you choose the video game you're going to play and you play it, we choose our lives and we play the video games for experience, for the experience of it. Come and live our lives for the experience of it. So the geometry of this second system is, as I've shown you, the circle or the wheel, and the intent is expansion. Now, here's where things get really interesting if you're following along. Humanity has spent quite a bit of time as hunter-gatherers, called the tribal era. And we still have tribes today, but before the agrarian age, say back around 7,000 BCE, we had the tribal era. What was that like? Well, we can look at tribes today, or tribes in the recent past, like the American Indians. We find they're very group-oriented, very nature-based. All is seen as cyclical. The animals, plants, minerals, or stones have consciousness, as I've talked about. And the land is sacred, which I feel that, when you work with the world, the Davic world, as I have, you really feel that I feel that land is sacred. So what would that have to do with reincarnation? So I came up with another system, a third one. So we have the linear system, we have the simultaneous system. Now, this is the cyclical system of reincarnation. And we emanate from a group that we call the higher self, just like the tribes were group-oriented. And lives are lived as part of a great cycle, just like we see the cycle of nature. We see it in the seasons. We see it in the earth revolving around the sun. We see it in the birth to death cycle. So, and certainly that was acknowledged by those societies. In cyclical reincarnation, we come here to experience a sacred harmony and oneness with nature and the land, which mirrors the sacred harmony and oneness with all that is. And when I read about, for instance, the Lakota or the Ojibwa, this is how they talk. This is what they say they're doing here. And so instead of coming here to learn lessons, they come here more to be with nature. And instead of learning lessons, we're just remembering. We're remembering, oh yes, we can see the maple tree, for instance, and it has lots of leaves. Well, that's sort of like us, producing lots of leaves which come and go, just like we come and go. But the leaves will come again, just like we'll have new births and then we'll have deaths. And the cycle just keeps on going. So the geometry that I've found works with this system is the spiral, and the intent is being. So I have some slides here that I want to show you. So here we have a group of souls in the light, and they're the ones that emanate the lives, just like the simultaneous model. But instead of a wheel, we have the spiral. And the spiral, here we have the one entity bringing out lives, and they're the lives lived one after another, but all simultaneous, just like the simultaneous model. And what makes me wonder about this and how there might be something to it is if we look at the artwork that comes out of the tribal era, like the Celtic, this is the Biscaylian, they had an interest in the spiral. No one knows exactly what this means, but maybe it has something to do with what I'm talking about. I don't know. That's, all of this is speculation. Certainly would want your input on it, which is one of the reasons I'm presenting this. We also have sacred geometry, and this is the famous golden section. And It follows what's called the Fibonacci series with these numbers. If you add 8, 5, you get 13, 8 and 13, 21, around you go. And you find this in nature. There's a nautilus shell. You also find it, the ancients knew, in order to create beauty, there's that slide again, they could use the golden section. There's that same golden section, and to help to create the famous Parthenon in Athens, Greece. But let's go back. Remember I showed you that slide? Now let's look at this slide. There it is again. It's almost as if nature's saying, hey, why don't you look here? You might find something. You find that there's a spiral, and it's coupled with sacred geometry. So the cyclical reincarnation model doesn't necessarily negate the other two, but rather incorporates them. For instance, the line of linear reincarnation is part of the curve of the spiral. We just see it as a line, but it's really a curve. And the circle in simultaneous reincarnation is realized in the ever-expanding spiral, and the expansiveness that we find in simultaneous reincarnation is also here in this tribal model. So, to think, if our current civilization were somehow completely destroyed, including our knowledge base, our libraries, our computers, and few of us survived, what would remain is, guess what? What we find in the tribal era, the relationship with nature and its cycles, which tells me maybe we should be looking here. Maybe there's something for us to learn. So, finally, perhaps cyclical reincarnation with its spiral is a model to consider. It's apparent in timeless nature. Sacred geometry is inherent within it. And when you look, you even find it in the stars. So, thank you very much for listening.